Okie dokie. Well, we'll just go ahead and get started. While y'all are working on this activity, I will go ahead and, how so y'all can see. Hang on. There we go. So this is an activity similar to the last one we did, where y'all will just click into this Google Docs and then put in your answers without your name, so that you don't feel like you're disclosing anything personal. And so it's just a standard Google Doc, and you can add in the stuff that is true of you. And so these are the questions you'll be answering. Where have you seen examples of how what's going on with your mental health influences your physical health and vice versa? What coping mechanisms work for you when you are stressed? What coping mechanisms have you tried that have not worked? So maybe, that Netflix binge works sometimes, but not when you have deadlines, right? Things like that. And what's one thing you can do as we head into finals to help your mind-body connection stay healthy? So again, if you type in this tiny URL, it should take you right to this, and I will drop it in the chat in case people on Zoom can't see it as well. So I know depending on what screen you're looking at on Zoom, it can be pretty tiny. About one blank. Oh yeah, yeah, that's fine. Just checking in occasionally, so everyone isn't done and sitting on something. Right, I'm gonna give it just a minute or two more and then we'll start reading. And if y'all are still typing, you can do that on the later questions while I go over the early ones. Yeah. So if you go to the PowerPoint, you should be able to click from like the Google Slides for today. But if you're on a Mac, I know one of my alums has been having a hard time accessing anything Google since the new like security update, so it might be that. Like he couldn't even fill out a Google form. It was very annoying. Alrighty, so some people are still typing, but I'm gonna go ahead and start reading here. And let me go ahead and make this a little bigger, just for everybody's eyes. And I appreciate that some of you felt comfortable using your names. You didn't have to, but that's great. So where have you seen examples of how what's going on with your mental health influences your physical health and vice versa? So when I'm stressed and worried, I have trouble focusing. Yeah, it can actually affect how our brain is processing things, right? When I'm stressed, I feel more fatigue, and sometimes when I get overwhelmed, I feel nauseous. Yes. The most stressed I've ever been in my life. I was the week before match for internship, but it's like if you don't match, you have to like add a year to your PhD. It's very stressful, and I couldn't eat because I was so nauseous. I tend to get headaches. If I'm ever very anxious, I can feel physically sick. Yeah. I've noticed more when grieving is involved. Oh, this is such a good point. I've seen some family members have to go to the hospital because of the agony they felt. On the opposite, more positive end, I had stage 4 cancer, and the entire time I had treatment, I was feeling okay. I truly believe it's because I kept a positive attitude. Yeah, Melissa, A, thank you for sharing that. B, so glad you're doing okay. And C, there is actually research showing that like a positive attitude and hope helps with the healing process. Makaya, when I'm stressed or overthink too much, I tend to have a harder time sleeping and focusing. Yes, been experiencing that myself lately. When I get headaches a lot and my stomach will start to hurt or cramp up. Yup. And when I get excited, I start to feel sick sometimes. When I'm stressed, I can't focus. Yeah, a lot of you mentioned like stomach issues. This is actually one of the reasons why some of the therapies we talked about, like cognitive behavioral therapy, will actually work for physical conditions like IBS because they're so stress related. So you can do talk therapy for some physical symptoms. Really interesting. What coping mechanisms work for you? Allow myself to take breaks and not to feel bad about it. Running, yeah, exercise in general often works for folks. Taking a little break from the task and just going to do something else, yeah. I run as well. I also just stop what I'm doing and breathe because sometimes I forget to do that. Yeah, that's such a good point. And the types of breathing that were in the example video that we looked at the other day can be really helpful. Stepping away from what's stressing me out, taking a drive, working out, talking to someone else about it. Yeah. Listening to music. It's a good distraction. Yeah. And sometimes you can pick out music that really reflects what's going on. I was fortunate enough to be in high school when Alanis Morissette's music came out, and like high school's a pretty angsty time. So I really vibed with her first album a lot. I like to sit down and start thinking of a couple of ways I can solve my issues, take a couple deep breaths. Reading helps me stay grounded while also stepping away from the problem for a little while. Yeah. I have a Kindle and I'll just read like romance novels at night just to like turn my brain off from academic things. What coping mechanism have you tried that have not worked? Just keeping your problems and stresses to yourself. Yeah, sometimes talking to somebody, even if you feel like you're going to burden the other person, right, can be really helpful. Talking about the situation sometimes doesn't work. Yeah, because then sometimes you end up like miring and dwelling in it. Keeping everything to myself. Yeah, a lot of people are saying this. Making lists of the things I need to do. Yeah, sometimes making lists is just more overwhelming, right? And then you look at everything and you're like, oh, keeping it bubbled in, doing work nonstop for more than 3 hours and not giving my brain a break. Again, there's some great research related to this about, making sure that you are giving yourself little breaks. I know a colleague who actually has a program installed on her computer that I think it's like every 2 hours that her screen will actually dim. And that's an indicator she needs to get up and like walk around her building. Kind of cool. What's the one thing you can do as we head into finals to help your mind-body connection stay healthy? Keeping those self-care days and studying now instead of procrastinating. Yeah, that's so hard to do, right? But yeah, trying to eat healthy and get enough sleep. That's so hard when you're stressed out. I remember one time for finals in college, my boyfriend at the time like smuggled me food out of the dining hall because we didn't have the takeout option like y'all do. Because I was just like, no, I need to keep studying. Not healthy. Keep up with exercise, drink lots of water, get the right amount of sleep, get enough sleep, keep up with work, but take breaks. Yeah. Look over notes and reading, not like to the last minute. And then make sure I stay focused as well as getting enough sleep and taking healthy breaks. Yeah. And I know that coming up, student activities will do a lot of cool things. They often have like massage therapists and coloring activities and therapy dogs. So definitely take advantage of those as we go into this stressful time. Awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing. I very much appreciate that. And so what we're going to start talking about, and this will probably bleed over into Friday because I got like really enthusiastic about data last night, is to talk about COVID and mental health, because this is obviously a pressing issue right now. So I have a quick video just to remind us all what COVID actually is, because I think sometimes we get so mired in the word that like we forget it's an actual disease and how it works.
So the whole family of coronaviruses are named coronavirus because corona means crown. And so this refers to the way that the virus looks under the microscope, like there's a crown on the top of the virus. Some of them, 4 or 5 different kinds, cause common diseases among humans. Everything from the common cold to mild or moderate respiratory illnesses. Other kinds of coronaviruses affect animals. And sometimes, on rare occasions, we see coronaviruses jump from animal species into the human population.
And that's what happened with COVID-19. I think that it was like a bat had it and it gave it to a Patagonian, I can't quite pronounce it right, at a meat market, and then that was transmitted to people.
The 2019 novel coronavirus is getting a lot of attention now because it is a new kind of coronavirus we haven't seen among humans before. The theory is that it may have jumped from an animal species into the human population and then begun spreading. We have seen some people that have died of this disease, and we know that there are already thousands of cases. So people are concerned because we don't yet know exactly how severe the disease will be or how far it will spread.
I think this is from 2020.
When a new virus emerges, we often have to learn much more about it. And one of the things that we question is, how does it transmit from person to person? We know that most respiratory viruses are spread by large droplets that come out when people cough and sneeze and stay aloft usually for about 6 feet in front of them. They land on surfaces and then can also be transmitted between person to person by touching those surfaces, such as doorknobs or other surfaces. Other viruses can spread in the air and stay aloft for a longer period of time in small droplet nuclei. For this current 2019 coronavirus, we're not yet sure whether it is droplet or airborne transmission. So we're erring on the side of caution.
So, and now we do know it's airborne transmission. I mean, it can be both, but it's an aerosol, which means that, like, if I'm talking here and I had it, I don't. Like, and someone was sitting in the back row, in theory, I could infect them. Because it'll stay in the air. It's the 6 feet is less pressing when something's an aerosol.
And taking protection as if it was spread by the airborne route. We're still learning a lot about this 2019 novel coronavirus to understand how dangerous it might be. Right now, the majority of the cases.
And so this is, I'm gonna stop this just because, like, this is really focused on a couple years ago, but it's still true that we're still figuring out what this virus is and what the long-term implications are going to be. So what are the physical symptoms? So I found this on the CDC's website, and one of the things they put at the bottom of this is they're gonna update this as the virus mutates, right? Because with each new strain mutation, these change. So for example, I had a couple different friends who got the strain over the summer, and for them, it was much more these gastrointestinal symptoms, which was not at all true of the initial strains of COVID. So fever or chills, but you don't have to have any single one of these if you have COVID. And in fact, some people are essentially asymptomatic, but can still spread it, even though they don't realize they have it. And these symptoms can appear anywhere from 2 to 14 days after exposure. So fever or chills, cough, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, fatigue, muscle or body aches, headache. I think one of the more hallmark symptoms, although not everybody gets this, is the loss of taste or smell. This is something that's pretty unique to COVID. Sore throat, congestion or runny nose, and then, like I said, nausea or vomiting and diarrhea. And again, you can have any constellation of those. You can essentially have no symptoms. And that's one of the things that's made it so hard to track this virus. And this illustrates more what I was talking about COVID being an aerosol. So as she was saying in the video, droplets, which is how we initially thought it spread, travel less than a meter, so 6 feet-ish, fall to the ground in under 5 seconds, and can't be inhaled. So you need to, like, touch a surface and then touch your nose, eyes, mouth. And that's why the initial part of the pandemic, we were doing 6 feet apart, we were sanitizing everything, and it certainly can be transmitted that way. But the more common way that COVID is transmitted is as an aerosol. And these are smaller particles, and they can go beyond 1 meter, as I just said. They can float in the air for hours, and they can be inhaled. And this is one of the reasons why COVID is so contagious. There are anecdotal cases. New Zealand has done a really good job with contact tracing. And they have cases where someone with COVID, like, walked through a hallway, coughed, breathed, whatever, And then someone else walked through that same hallway a while later and got it that way. And so that's rare, obviously, but means that we should be cautious. And this is why I'm having everybody mask in my classes, because that is the best way to protect ourselves. Really interesting thing, and I didn't pull anything from this, I should have. So at the initial part of the pandemic, they were thinking it had to be droplets because there was this old like line in a pamphlet at the CDC that said that aerosols had to be even smaller than this. And they went back and they researched it, and there was no like scientific evidence for it. It was just something someone had typed out at one point in time. It just kept getting passed and passed. So the scientists who figured out it was an aerosol had to convince the CDC it was, right? And so that's why the messaging has not been super clear about the fact that it's an aerosol. So what can you do if you are exposed? Because unfortunately it is still going around, right? Watch your symptoms for 10 days, test. If you're still coming up positive on a COVID test, even if that second line is just light pink, you can still transmit it. Wear a mask around others when you're indoors for 10 days, even better if you can. Quarantine. Test 5 days after exposure or sooner if you have symptoms. And it can take a little bit to actually pop positive on an at-home test. So for example, one of my friends who had it over the summer had her gastrointestinal symptoms for I think 2 days before it actually came up positive. And then take extra precautions, especially when you're around vulnerable people. Now the CDC, unfortunately, bowed to pressure from industry. In particular, I believe Delta Airlines was one of the big people who pushed for this and said, if you test positive, you can go back to work after 5 days. Again, there's no science to back that up. And in fact, most scientific experts say you should wait until you test negative. So what are the global health implications? So I looked this up last night, and actually if you just search like global COVID-19 deaths on Google, this will pop up. Google's actually making this data readily available from this particular website. So as of last night, there have been 642 million cases worldwide and 6.63 million deaths. Yeah.
That doesn't COVID or with COVID?
This is all specific to COVID. So more people have died than this worldwide, right? Because people are still dying of cancer and car accidents and things like that. But this is just COVID. And this is really interesting because that's a good question, because like these are just like confirmed COVID deaths. So there might be some we're not accounting for, right? If the person never tested or something like that. This is hard to wrap your head around, right? That's such a big number of 6.5 million people having died from this. And I think it's going to take a while for us as a society to reckon with these numbers, right? And you can see this is over time, the deaths. So I believe this was, like March 2020, and then you can see it has gone down, but there are still people dying every day. So as of 2 days ago, there were still almost 1,200 deaths worldwide on that day, right? And so I'm not putting this up to scare you guys. I think it's just important that we acknowledge that this is still going on, right? And the science says like this is still a thing, as much as everyone is tired of it and wants to pretend it's not. So what about in the US? So we have had 98 million cases and over 1 million deaths, coming up on 1.2 million. This is really hard for me to wrap my head around. So I know y'all were either too young or not born yet when 9/11 happened, but 9/11 was 5,000 Americans who died. This is 1 million, right? And so I think when we finally are able to like pause and take a minute and like try to process this, it's going to be really hard, Like there will be a period of mourning as a nation to realize we have lost this many people. This is also why when people are like, why is it so hard to hire people right now? It's like all over 1 million people have died, right? Those are people who most likely would have been in the workforce. And then the other thing is long COVID, which we'll get to in a few slides. So there are people who are permanently disabled essentially from COVID. So these certainly have implications. And again, still people are dying at the rate of, I think there were like 200 who died the last day reported. So. And I think because these numbers are so overwhelming, unfortunately, we've become callous about it. We're like, oh, only 200 people died. Like, that's 200 people who had families, right? And who had friends and who might have been in the workforce. And it's, again, really hard to wrap our heads around. So what are the mental health implications of this? So we know that there was a huge increase in mental health issues during the pandemic. Not even directly related to the virus. I mean, slightly. It wasn't like you got the virus and then you developed mental health issues. It was people were developing mental health issues because of isolation, because of anxiety about getting the virus, because of depression, because they didn't have their normal activities. And we also saw increased utilization, not surprisingly, of mental health. And what helped with that is the real advent of telehealth. So telehealth or video therapy has been around for years. I want to say it started in like the 90s, and it was literally telehealth. Like you call your therapist over the phone and talk to them that way. And now it's, a HIPAA compliant version of Zoom, basically, that you would use for that. And this has made it much more accessible for people, but also means that therapists often have really long waiting lists, right? Because they fill up pretty quickly with these folks. I know, like, I was finishing my therapy for postpartum depression during the pandemic. And I was obviously pretty close to my therapist. I'd been seeing her for a while. And so I talked to her about, sort of how this was happening. And she said, it was hard because it's harder to read body language over the screen because you're only seeing from here up instead of the whole body. But she said there was also a lot lower costs for her. So she didn't have to rent office space, buy furniture, all that stuff. And so she was thinking about just staying all virtual for that reason. We also know that there are implications for mental health from long COVID, partially because of how it affects the brain, and partially just because, as we've talked about with some of these other disorders, if you get a life-changing disorder, a life-changing diagnosis, that is going to affect how you view the world, right? You're going to be tired, you're going to be depressed, maybe. So the American Psychological Association has a whole center on their webpage of various resources and information about the pandemic and mental health in particular. So stress management tools, affecting kids who've lost caregivers, right? That's something we haven't even thought about. But if you're a kid and both your parents died from COVID, right? That's something else we haven't really reckoned with. There are specifically resources for therapists on here as well. And I know here's an example. The APA has been doing a lot of research in terms of like stress levels in the United States in general, but also looking at how therapists themselves are doing, because this has been more about therapists too. And so I wanted to look more into how COVID-19 actually affects the brain. I feel like there we go. And so this is from a recent article from JAMA, which is one of the most respected medical journals. And So the really interesting thing is that seems like the vast majority of the time, the virus itself doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. But because of the damage the virus does to the body, there can still be implications directly into the brain. So, for example, they can go into the capillaries, those little tiny blood vessels in the brain. You can see there's damage of various types, and platelets can become too activated. You could see increased glutamate, which can build up and be like gunk in the brain. Upregulation of receptors. Anytime you're altering your receptors in the brain, that has implications for mental health. And depletion of neurotransmitters is probably the most concerning, because we know that neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine are all linked to things like depression, anxiety, even schizophrenia, right? And so now we're perhaps creating these disorders through these biochemical changes in the brain. So that's going to alter neurotransmission, or your ability to send messages throughout your brain, can cause damage to neurons. What can happen is what's called synaptic pruning. So the synapses are where two neurons talk to each other, and your brain will go through and get rid of the ones you don't need. And if there's dysregulation because of, this brain pathology, what will happen is it'll take away ones you actually need, right? Because the brain thinks you don't need them anymore. There's other types of injury. So if you end up hypoxic at any point, like, when you can't breathe, oxygen doesn't get to your brain. We know that's one of the things that happens to people who get COVID very severely, why they have to be on respirators, right? Is they have a really hard time. I've heard it described as they feel like they're trying to breathe through concrete, like it just feels heavy. Anytime blood or oxygen's not getting to the brain, that potentially results in brain damage as well. And so some of the symptoms that we're seeing are attention and cognitive deficits, new onset anxiety, some suicidal behavior, depression, psychosis, again, I mentioned schizophrenia, and even seizures if things are dysregulated. So one of the things that happens is these nodules will build up. So this is microglial nodules. The glial cells are the helper cells in the brain. And if they're dysregulated, if they're sort of told we need more of you than we actually do, they can kind of build up essentially and become, it's like, if you've ever seen a drain during a storm when there's a lot of trash, right? And it kind of, all that trash sort of builds up right in front of the drain. It's like that. And so this is one neuron and this is the other neuron. And you can see like right in the synapse where they should be trying to talk to each other is all this gunk. So that's going to affect transmission as well. And this type of pathology is really similar to what happens in several known types of dementias. So in Alzheimer's, you have a buildup of gunk in the brain called amyloid beta. In other types of dementias like frontotemporal, you have different types, Lewy body, the Lewy body is built up. So this is why you have people who are pretty young who are essentially getting symptoms of dementia, unfortunately, from long COVID. And again, this isn't going to happen to everyone with COVID, but right now we can't reliably predict who this will happen to. All right, so I have another video here about.
We are about to begin a study of effects of infection with the 2019 novel coronavirus that causes what everyone knows as COVID-19. This study is focused on an area that many people may not think about when they think about COVID. People who are younger, in the range of 18 to 35 or so, people who are previously healthy, people who did have the COVID-19 disease, but at a mild level. So they never needed to go to hospital. And we're then looking at actually how the virus potentially affected their brain and what those implications might mean for the long run. Now, that is something that may come as a surprise to many people because, again, we don't sort of reflexively associate COVID-19 with brain effects. But actually, very early in the pandemic, it became clear that infection with this virus does have effects on the brain.
Since the advent of the vaccine and some changes in the SARS-CoV-2 that's circulating, we see less death and severe disease and admissions, which is great news. What the public may not realize is that they can still develop mild COVID, and that can result in long COVID. And this is what occurs after recovery from the infection. 60 days, 90 days, 6 months later, you have persistence of symptoms. And they could be pulmonary, exercise tolerance isn't at the level it was, cardiac, or neurocognitive, which typically manifests as loss of memory, unable to concentrate. Some studies say this occurs in.
So for example, I've heard of very fit people who are marathon runners, who 6 weeks after they have COVID try to return to their normal exercise regime and they can't even run a mile, right? Because it affects them cardiovascularly.
30 to 50% of people who've had COVID-19. And what's really interesting is that it can occur in people who had very mild COVID-19 and no other medical conditions. And what is very powerful about the study is Michael Lipton and his group have very in-depth neurocognitive testing and neuroimaging of healthy residents of the Bronx. And so when the pandemic emerged and we started to hear anecdotally that patients were having problems with memory, concentration, he thought we could restudy this group. And this is a very powerful study design because any changes we see, we can attribute to COVID-19.
The way we're going to go about doing this is by turning to a cohort of hundreds of patients who were examined and were healthy prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic because they participated in other studies at Albert Einstein and Montefiore. And those are individuals for whom we now have a very clear baseline of what their brain looked like through MRI scans, what some of their blood chemistry looked like, and what their brain function looked like.
And the reason that we need to study this is that it's going to affect a large percentage of the population. And one thing that we're worried about is if there's any inflammation or damage to the brain, will this result in something that happens 10, 20 years down the line in terms of loss of neurocognitive function? So we don't know what it means if you have long COVID now, and what are the implications for your health 10, 20 years later on. This kind of study is going to start to answer that by asking, how does it actually manifest that I can measure in terms of neurocognitive testing, neuroimaging, how long will it last? And in our case, we're studying 3 years. And the other thing that we're trying to do is develop biomarkers. So from all of our patients, we're going to collect blood, and in patients who have clear changes, we're then going to study to determine if we can figure out blood biomarkers. Again, this can be used to study the general population, and we can use them in case we have interventions to see if they're responding to therapy.
In designing the currently funded study, we did do some preliminary testing, and we know therefore that while very preliminary, that there do seem to be some demonstrable trends which show that individuals who had the coronavirus infection, and again, were either mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic, compared to individuals who did not, show a modest but clear decline in measures coming from MRI of their brain structure that are consistent with inflammatory changes in the brain. in terms of areas of cognitive function like memory and attention and information processing speed.
So like what this means is that people who are saying, I'm having trouble remembering things, I feel like I'm in a brain fog, like they are finding brain explanations for that. It's not in their head. There are actually changes in the brain.
There is a spectrum of severity. Some people may have, with the same disease, a more severe manifestation. Some may have a less severe manifestation. Some may have the same disease going on in their brain that is actually subclinical, meaning they don't notice any symptoms, but it could be at a very low level where the same inflammation is going on, not at a severe enough degree to cause symptoms now, but could be a harbinger of future brain dysfunction down the road. That's why understanding the mechanisms and potentially developing targeted treatment are important to try and head off future, obviously, clinically significant problems in people who right now may have lower levels of change in the brain.
What I find interesting about SARS-CoV-2 is this persistence of symptoms. For me, as an infectious disease physician, that's very unusual. And we do see in some of our patients that have persistent symptoms, it's really affecting their day-to-day life in terms of their thinking, their ability to think, their memory, this feeling of mental fogginess. Some patients aren't able to exercise as they did in the past. And I would tell my patients that as transmission rates rise in your community, you can do something very simple, which is put a mask on, because we don't know who's at risk for long COVID. So I would suggest keeping an eye on transmission levels in your community. Put that mask on. I think we're all kind of used to it at this point. I would use the N95, which are better at preventing transmission. And if we need to get additional boosters coming in the fall in case rates go up, I would do that. We want to try to prevent being infected. We don't want to have a risk of long haul COVID. And we don't want to infect our family and friends.
And one thing that they didn't mention, but that the research is showing, is that the more times you get COVID, the higher your risk for long COVID.
Yeah, what about people who, like, you know how one of the biggest things with COVID was that, like, a lot of people, like, didn't have symptoms, like, they're just, like, spreaders.
Yep.
So, like, what if you, like, have it, but you get, like, nothing from it, if that's still, like.
Yeah, and that's part of what the researchers are doing here, is like people who are asymptomatic or just had it mildly. Some of them are also having these brain changes. So again, it's gonna take us years to have enough research to really understand this effect.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is like for people who might not have even realized they had the disease, right? It could have these long-term effects, which is really scary. Yeah, I've seen, and I think I have some of these stats on the coming slides, anywhere from like 5 to 30%. And then you saw on that the other side, up to 50% of people who have COVID develop long COVID. Right, and those stats will change as we get further out, and we recognize people might have symptoms even further out than we expect. So I thought that, you know, looking at their research was really helpful. And then this was from the NIH, and this is just some of the other studies. And this is just a small collection that have been funded to look at COVID and mental health in particular. Mental health of New Yorkers from communities hard hit. So New York City, other major cities have been really hard hit, and particularly people of color, people of low SES who had to keep going to their frontline jobs. Mobile apps to address mental health disparities, you know, trying to make it more accessible so you don't have to go someplace, right? Looking at mask usage for kids and seeing were there effects on their emotional and brain development. Preliminary research has suggested no, and that the benefits outweigh the risk, but we just still need to look at that, right? Let's see, underserved and vulnerable populations, and looking at the development of children. Alcohol misuse. So I've had a couple articles on people developing or exacerbating substance abuse issues during the pandemic. as a way to cope. Let's see, the stressors affecting people during the pandemic. So trying to get people from all 50 states, which I think is really good because your experience might be totally different if you're in a really populous state than if you're living in a rural area, right? All right, so what is this long COVID? So again, the most common statistic you've seen now, and this is from May-ish, is about 1 in 5 adults are going to develop long COVID, so 20%. So we just talked about the neurologic and mental health conditions. We've mentioned the cardiovascular and respiratory conditions. Some people are getting kidney failure. That's not good, obviously. That can lead to death pretty quickly. Musculoskeletal conditions, aches, pains, difficulty getting around, and blood clots and vascular issues. And again, these can be really difficult and challenging and potentially fatal if you have a blood clot. So these are the percentages of patients who have each of the symptoms. So you can see, like the disease itself, these really vary in terms of how many people get them. So you can see most people who have long COVID, they're going to be doing the fatigue, the shortness of breath. Some people, their loss of smell has persisted 6 months, a year. I read fairly recently about the Yankee Candle effect. So you can tell when there's an uptick in COVID in a certain area when reviews of Yankee candles from that area are like, this candle doesn't have any smell, so I'm returning it. Because if anyone's ever walked in a Yankee Candle store, you know they all have really strong smells, right? And they're mostly pleasant. So typically that's an indicator that those people actually have COVID and might not have realized it, or maybe have long COVID. But I just love that there's a Yankee Candle effect. So this is, and again, we're fairly new in this pandemic. So 7 months out is actually a pretty impressive study at this point in time. But you can see 7 months out from their initial symptoms, we're having fatigue in like 60% of people. No, actually closer to 80% of people with long COVID. Malaise is like almost depression, not quite. That brain fog we talked about, sensory motor symptoms, headaches, memory issues, insomnia, and then some of the other symptoms related to muscles, cardiovascular, respiratory. So it really does seem like these brain and mental health symptoms are going to be the lingering effects of long COVID. And so obviously pretty darn relevant to psychology and something that we'll be reckoning with for years to go. So again, statistics go vary like crazy in terms of how many people might be getting long COVID. How can you prevent it? Wearing an N95 or a KN95, highly recommend. You can get them on Amazon now. Understanding the levels, you can go to the CDC or Virginia Public Health website and see what the levels are. And then just getting vaccinated and boosted. I'll just put in a personal plug for the most recent booster. I was in the study trial for it. I was knowingly exposed to COVID twice over the summer, like the 2 times I had masked around people. Of course, I got exposed. Did not get it either time. So highly recommend the new bivalent booster. All right, yeah.
Unrelated to COVID, that kind of like poster, that's part of what our infographic.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's part of what I tried to do is I made this poster to give you some ideas of infographic stuff. All right, cool. Well, we will wrap this up and then do our Jeopardy on Friday.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was just wondering, I have a 0 to like 7 assignments, like the CLSN.
Yeah, so I haven't gone back in to connection.
So those are the connects,
yeah.
okay, because I've done all of those.
Yeah,
So I,
once we go to the whole
Yeah,
chapter.
so
So yeah, I was again, I was gonna do it over Thanksgiving and
I just want to keep it all graded, so I just want to
Yeah,
make
yeah,
sure it wasn't.
So
like-
yep, no, I'll try to do it in the next like week or so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for checking.
Yeah, I was making sure they were like set 0.
No. Yeah, they're definitely gonna get. Yeah, I was gonna like clear them out after midterms are posted and then I realized like people might get more
Stressed out.
like motivated to get them done.
Oh,
if they saw the
yeah.
zero. You too. Yeah.
Sorry, this is back on Monday, but I didn't want to stay in class because I have a bad